Well, hello. I am Katharina Kreissig and currently co-chair of the Athena Swan Committee within the Department of Earth Science and Engineering. And on behalf of the team, I would like to welcome everyone to this International Women's Day event. Please be aware that the session will be recorded. International Women's Day has been celebrated on the 8th of March for exactly 100 years. So it was a rather special Monday, last Monday. Before 1921, they did happen on different days of the year. Clara Zetkin, a German feminist, was instrumental to the establishment of this special Women's Day, which was decided during a conference in August 1910. She was a greatly acclaimed personality and was made sort of political heroine in the German Democratic Republic where I grew up. So during my childhood and teenage years in the 70s and 80s, the International Women's Day was a huge, huge thing. So from children's letters to their mums organized at school, to flowers and cards and dinner invitations, or even possibly cooked dinner from husbands and spouses, to official banquets and celebrations in industry and politics. It was mostly to thank women and acknowledge that they did more than men when it came to household matters and childcare, although everywhere else they were treated as equal. It was a difficult process to realize that gender equality, which I obviously have taken for granted, did not exist elsewhere during my early adulthood. And particularly as a young mother, I appreciated that there's still a lot which should be changed in order to reach it. And that International Women's Day can be used to raise awareness to gender inequality. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Heather Ford, who will give a short talk about who gets to speak, voices minoritized at scientific conferences. Heather is an ERC Fellow and lecturer in environmental science at Queen Mary University, London. She is a paleoceanographer who uses the chemistry of marine sediments to understand past and future climate change. After the talk, we will have a discussion, and I'm delighted to welcome our two panelists, Dr. Genevieve Boshoff and Professor Stephen Curry. Unfortunately, our third one, Elisa De Ranieri, can't join us due to technical problems we couldn't solve before, even without with the help of our ICT team. So Jen Boshhoff has over 20 years of experiences in science and engineering, having worked both in industry and academia. She is currently Capability Manager for Effluents and Environmental Chemistry at the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory, supporting the decommission of some of the UK's most high-hazard nuclear facilities. Stephen Curry is Professor of Structural Biology and Assistant Provost for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Imperial College London. For many years, he has been a writer and campaigner on a range of scientific issues, including open access, research assessment, research funding, and science policy. He is also currently chair of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. In addition, I would like to welcome Melanie Lee from Imperial College London, who will facilitate the session, and I encourage everybody to place questions into the chat. Melanie has extensive experience working in large charitable organizations, leading to the strategic development and operational implementation of equality, diversity and inclusion activity. Melanie has integrated her knowledge and experience in this field into her career as an organizational development consultant in the NHS and at Imperial. She's experienced working with individuals, teams and large groups, and is versed in the management of group processes and dynamics, as well as being a trained mediator. And now I pass on to Heather Ford.
Can you see my slides? Okay. All right. As long as you can hear me, if not, there's subtitles that are live. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the research that I've done over the past couple years, looking at how different minoritized voices have an opportunity to speak at a scientific conference that's actually near and dear to the geoscience community, the American Geophysical Union. And so first of all, I would like to acknowledge that I didn't do all of this work myself. My colleagues Cameron, Margarita, Corinne, and Petra also contributed to this work. And I also want to acknowledge the American Geophysical Union, AGU, for opening up their data archive for the database of abstracts that they have, and being as transparent as they can be for thinking about who gets to speak within their conference. So this work that I'm going to be sharing with you today has already been published. The first one was looking specifically at gender inequality in speaking opportunities at the American Geophysical fall meeting that happens every year. And I do want to highlight, for the most part, when I'm talking about gender representation, this is largely reflecting white women because the geosciences is largely, is overwhelmingly white. Then the second analysis that we did was looking at ethnic and racial representation within the American Geophysical meeting as well. And we did have the opportunity to look at the intersection of how race and gender play in terms of who gets an opportunity to speak at the meeting. If you have any questions, certainly follow up with me, and my email is listed there for you to be able to contact me. And I'm also just up the road at Queen Mary, so I'm local. So I wanted to start off briefly, why do we go to scientific conferences in general? Although with coronavirus, the way that we've interacted with scientific conferences has changed over the last year, but in general, the purpose of going to a scientific conference is to network with colleagues and share the recent research that you've been doing. Another thing that you can do is look for jobs, and then you can look for funding opportunities. So going to a scientific conference is important for your visibility among the scientific community and among your peers, and networking for different opportunities. And so the American Geophysical Union is the world's largest physical sciences meeting. It has over 20,000 attendees and abstracts submitted annually. And I've been attending the American Geophysical Union fall meeting, the AGU fall meeting, for over a decade at this point. From a student to an early career researcher, and I was sort of increasingly frustrated seeing that, the people who were speaking within the conference were largely white and they were largely men. And I was interested to seeing whether or not the representation of who gets to speak within the meeting is equitable across different groups. So when you are an author submitting an abstract to attend AGU, there's a couple different ways that you can present your data. One is that you can be invited by the program committee or the conveners. So this is kind of a prestigious thing to have, to be invited to speak at AGU. The other option that you have as an author is that you can request that the program committee or the conveners assign you either a talk or a poster. And your third option is you can request a poster. So if you're not necessarily comfortable speaking, or your values are different in terms of where you are within your research, like you feel like it might fit a poster presentation to be able to informally interact with your colleagues, you might ask for a poster presentation to share your research. So just to recap, your three different options for attending the fall meeting as an author is you can be invited to speak. You can either be assigned a talk or a poster by the conveners, or you can opt for a poster yourself as the author. And I just want to say really quickly that sexism and racism aren't United States phenomenon. So even though I'm largely going to be talking about the American Geophysical Union fall meeting, which is based in the United States, and if you can tell from my accent, I'm also from the United States. Sexism and racism aren't just in the United States. What we can see from at least the UK and throughout Europe is that, for instance, Black female professors have really challenging barriers for participation and promotion within the academy. So I think that that's something important to say out loud, because I often get some weird comments from colleagues about sexism and racism being specific to the United States, and I think that that's just not true, obviously. The first instance, when we look at gender, the overall message is that white women are largely doing okay in terms of their representation. It's not to say that white women don't face barriers. Obviously they do, but when we actually look at the data and control for career stages, we're seeing that that women are represented in terms of speaking opportunities. So women, when they attend or when they register for the fall meeting and submit abstracts, they're more likely to opt for poster presentations. Overall, if you look at men versus women, they're underrepresented, and that's largely reflecting this, quote, leaky pipeline in the fact that we don't see as many women in more senior positions. But actually, when we control for career stages, women and men are actually pretty equal in terms of their speaking opportunities. So this is the data here in terms of who's assigned to speak by the program committee or by the conveners. Female authors or women authors are in green, and men authors are in black and gray. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that, yes, overall, women are underrepresented, but when we look at the career stages from student to early career to mid-career and experienced, we see that women actually have more speaking opportunities than men. It's not statistically significant, but we see that there is a healthy representation of women in terms of speaking opportunities across career stages. And one thing that I forgot to mention about this particular data set that I think is important is that all of the demographic data that I'm going to be sharing is self-declared, but one limitation of this data set is that authors can choose to be male, female, or prefer not to answer, so it doesn't capture the full spectrum of gender identity available. So anyways, the major point is that women have similar, or they're having equal opportunities to speak. But what's interesting is that when we look at the role of the convener or the program committee, what we see is that men tend to invite and assign fewer presentations to women. So what you're looking at here is the, for men and women conveners for their particular career stages. We see that men across career stages from student to experience levels do not invite their female colleagues to the proportion that we would expect of the abstract pool. So I think that this is interesting because we sort of have this idea that, you know, once all the old dinosaurs kind of die out of the academy, that suddenly there's going to be this equity among us, and that's not exactly true. What we're seeing is that men, students in early careers are not providing the similar amounts of opportunities to their women colleagues. So the implication here is that in order to have equity among the speaking opportunities for men and women, what we're seeing is that white women are doing the heavy lifting to improve the representation of other women. So women only control something like 30% of the abstract allocation. So within that 30% of abstracts that they are making this decision, they are overrepresenting women within speaking opportunities. So that overall, when we look at the data set, you actually have equality between men and women. So I think that's important to note. So to briefly move on from gender to thinking about racial and ethnic representation, as I mentioned before, the geosciences has a whiteness problem. So on the left-hand side, this is a paper published about an article published about a year ago that featured some of the work by Kuhili Dutt at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University and the work that she's been doing. And then on the right-hand side, you can look at what you're looking at here is the number of PhDs by racial identity, racial and ethnic identity for the United States in terms of who's been getting a PhD. And we can see that underrepresented minorities within the United States and globally are not necessarily, we're not seeing the diversity that we would expect, all things being equal, within the geoscience community. So the geosciences is overwhelmingly white. And as somebody who's a paleoceanographer and thinks about climate, I think that this is particularly problematic because for something like climate change, this really ends up being kind of a social justice issue. We need everybody on board for thinking about how we come up with new solutions and about how to tackle the climate crisis. And the fact that the earth sciences is overwhelmingly white is problematic. So just to briefly talk about the data set itself, again, the American Geophysical Union is a US-based institution, so the ethnicity data that we have is for the United States. One thing that we had to do, which is problematic, I would say, is because the representation of underrepresented minorities is so small, because that community is so small, in order to have any statistical power to look at the representation of these groups, we actually had to combine them into one group. So underrepresented minorities here represents Black, Latinx, Native American, and Pacific Islander. And the reason I say that that is problematic is because each of these groups have different experiences and different barriers for participation, and that's important to sort of honor, even though we ended up having to bin these in one group in order to have any statistical power. The other part is that the other group is non-underrepresented minorities, which is white and Asian American. And so within the United States, Asian Americans aren't actually considered an underrepresented group, which is why we grouped them with white participants. But Asian Americans also face barriers for participation within science and technology fields, and I think that's important to say as well. So if we look at the distribution of underrepresented minorities across the cohorts, we can see that they're focused within student and early career positions, and there are fewer underrepresented minorities in mid-career to late-stage careers. Whereas if you look at non-underrepresented minorities, there's a healthy representation within mid and late career, as well as early career and student. So when we control for career stage and look overall, underrepresented minorities have fewer speaking opportunities. So overall, they have, in terms of being an invited speaker at AGU, they are less likely to be invited, and they're less likely to be invited across career stages. And the hashed data here means that there were too few authors for comparison in terms of a statistical significance, but we still wanted to plot the data. Similarly, if we looked at how primary conveners assigned talks, overall underrepresented minorities had fewer opportunities to speak. And then again, as we look across career stages, we can see that student to late career, mid-career, were given fewer opportunities to speak at AGU. And I think one of the things that's particularly concerning is that if you look at the early career stage, we're seeing that underrepresented minorities are given fewer opportunities, and this is statistically significant. And I think this is a particularly vulnerable career stage, because this is the career stage where you're applying for jobs, you're trying to find money, you're trying to get your work published, and the fact that you don't have that same visibility as your white and Asian American counterparts can be problematic. Similarly, if we look at how underrepresented minorities, they're more likely to opt to present with a poster. So from overall to student, early career, and mid-career, they're more likely to choose posters, and it could be because of different I don't want to say insecurities, or that made to feel that their research isn't good enough for a talk, or it could be that their values just align with being more comfortable or being more interested in presenting their poster. Those are different options as to why somebody might opt for a poster over a speaking role. So another concept that I want to bring up is this idea of intersectionality, and this is a concept that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, And what you're looking at is how race, class, gender, and other characteristics intersect and overlap with one another within a social context or within a social structure. So just to kind of talk about that really briefly, I don't know if many of you watched or read The Babysitter's Club when you were growing up, but all of these girls or these babysitters at the time identified as women. And so Claudia, for instance, was Japanese American. Stacy was diabetic. Dawn was Latina. Marianne was a multi-ethnic, and Christy is a white, able-bodied woman, won't face the same sorts of barriers in terms of participation within society as her other peers. So this is kind of the idea of intersectionality. You can have a disability or how class or how race might intersect with gender or any other characteristic. So if we look at how race and gender influence this particular data set in terms of who gets to speak, what we see is that for underrepresented women, which are in light blue, men are in darker blue, non-underrepresented minority women are in a light yellow, and men are in a dark yellow. What we see is that underrepresented minority women are given fewer opportunities to be an invited speaker. In terms of being giving a talk, they're less likely to be given a talk in comparison to white and Asian American women and men. And they're also more likely to opt for poster presentations in comparison to underrepresented minority men and white and Asian American men and women. So we're seeing that how race and gender both intersect with each other so that they're given fewer opportunities to speak at the AGU meeting. And what's the role of the primary convener in this particular case? We weren't able to look at the data set across career stages, but one of the important things that we see is that we actually don't see any difference between men and women in terms of assigning underrepresented minorities talks. So I think sometimes there's this idea that women are, or at least white women, are more attuned to the struggles of underrepresented minorities, and we don't see this in the data set. We're not seeing that white women are more likely to provide opportunities for underrepresented minorities. So I think that's something that certainly needs addressing. And I think that I also want to acknowledge that this has kind of been the case throughout history. So, for instance, when you look at women's suffrage in the United Kingdom, women received the right to vote in 1918, but in the UK, that was really women who were over 30 who owned property and had a university education. So that largely reflected the participation of white women. And you have a similar thing within the United States that Black women, for instance, didn't really get the right to vote until 1965, even though we have an amendment within the United States that women were granted the right to vote in 1919. So what are some of the solutions? I think one of the things that we need to be really honest about ourselves is that we have these barriers for participation that are structurally racist or discriminatory for many different protected characteristics. So, for instance, admissions criteria for PhD programs can be structurally racist. So, in the United Kingdom, I found when I've been going through looking at admissions for PhD programs that having a master's is kind of a de facto requirement. But I think that, asking somebody to spend £10,000 on a master's so that they might be able to get into a PhD is a large barrier for participation across different groups. So things like AGU and other organizations have started programs like the Bridge program, and this would be kind of similar to ring fencing within the United Kingdom. So it provides an opportunity for underrepresented groups to find placements within PhD programs and support within the peer network so that they can really excel and within the geosciences. And there's a couple other things that we can talk about in terms of thinking about how do we deal with these kinds of issues in terms of representation. Small interventions can sometimes be successful. So AGU did a closed study where they looked at when you submit an abstract, one of the things that you do is suggest reviewers who might be interested in reviewing your work. And so what AGU did is they had a small intervention where they asked reviewers or authors when they were submitting their manuscripts to be mindful about diversity when they were suggesting potential reviewers. And they actually saw that that improved the gender diversity of the suggested reviewers. One thing that you can do is just blind review. Why does any sort of characteristic really influence how science gets done? The information about a name doesn't necessarily reflect or influence the quality of the work that's done. Large societies can also incorporate smaller underrepresented communities serving societies within the overall meeting structure. So things like SACNES, which largely incorporates Chicana, and Native American groups within the sciences. And Earth Science Women's Network is another opportunity. I also think broadly within the academy, we need to think about diversity and equity work as part of scholarship at the same level as our research outputs. And then finally, I think you need to put underrepresented minorities and white women in leadership positions, and you actually need to pay them. And I think that that will be helpful for thinking about how we improve the representation among all groups throughout the sciences. And with that, if there are any questions that I can answer, or we can move on to the panel discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, for this very, very informative talk. And I'm pretty sure there is lots of questions. So I hand on to Melanie.
Thank you very much, Katharina, and thank you too, Heather. Lots of food for thought there. Representation issues, very much the focus in terms of structural racism, sexism and its intersections, which creates the current picture of inequality and the possible solutions as identified by AGU. So now it's our opportunity for us to hear from you in terms of any questions you may have for the panel, for Heather specifically. Please do free to post your questions now. Okay.
There was one.
I'm sorry, Katharina, go ahead.
There was one question which I had here in the meeting chat, and it was that Heather mentioned the importance of diversity in tackling global issues such as climate crisis. What do our panelists think about increasing minoritized voices in their organizations or fields to feed into these big issues? Or what is happening to do this?
Thank you. So which one of the panel members would like to take that question first? Genevieve, perhaps if we begin with you.
Hi, yes, happy to respond to that. So within the National Nuclear Laboratories specifically, we have a really strong equality, diversity and inclusion group, which sort of is working specifically towards improving the diversity of the workforce across NNL and making it a more inclusive place for people to work. So there's a range of different initiatives, starting initially with obviously gathering that data, because the first step you have to do is understand, who have you got currently in your workforce, where are those gaps, where do you need to improve, that sort of thing. So we're undergoing a whole range of data gathering exercises. We've got working groups to address particular issues within the company that may have arisen. We've got working groups which include people from across the company looking at, well, our recruitment process. So how do we actually get a range of different people actually into the company at first, which is quite important. But then even more important is how do we actually retain those people? Because it's all very well you sort of recruiting sort of underrepresented minorities or women, but if you're losing them 5 years later, you're back to where you started. So I think slightly more important for us is, how do we make sure that we're keeping those people there? So it's that sort of flexible working, supporting work-life balance, giving people opportunity if they want to take career breaks. So it's, shared paternity, maternity leave, those sort of things. So there's a big drive within NNL to actually look at that and look at sort of health and well-being on that. And we make sure in all our working groups we have sort of people and representation from across the company.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, Genevieve. So a real sense there of the commitment around working groups across the company, examination of recruitment processes, but also this reflection that it is as important to examine how we retain diverse communities within the environment, as well as how we secure their involvement. Stephen, what's your thoughts on this one?
I think it's a very important question. I think diversity is obviously important in general in any scientific field because it brings together different perspectives and different ways of thinking, and it encourages interaction between individuals who do have different perspectives. And there is evidence, certainly in the business field, but actually emerging within science, that these kinds of differences actually, when they rub up against one another, they do generate new ideas and they do encourage actually better science. But I think it's even more important in areas of research where there is global or societal impact, because I think you need to have the diversity there to legitimize the creation of the research agenda, which is often driven by the academic community. And the sorts of questions that get asked, for example, about how to tackle climate change, how to think about the impacts on biodiversity, clearly they affect different communities differently. And I think unless you bring together a fully international and of course then bring together men and women who will have very different perspectives on these things, and people from different cultures and ethnicities, then you're not really going to get a picture or a sense of the problem that truly reflects the interests of the global population. So it is particularly interesting. This is one of the principles that drives our commitment to diversity at Imperial.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So that importance there of diversity globally and internationally, particularly in the context where there are social justice issues which are driving the research agenda, and the importance of having diverse voices. Okay, I've just seen another question come in, but before I go to the question, Heather, did you want to add anything, or Adriana, in terms of that first question?
Well, I think in terms of the effort that I've been putting in recently was really thinking about how do we, in terms of academic research or scientific research, how do we bring students of color within the programs, thinking about ring fencing, thinking about specific doctoral training programs that are at Black serving institutions within the United Kingdom, setting up strong peer networks, because that seems to be very important for the success of underrepresented groups in terms of recruitment and retention into more senior levels. So that's the kind of thing that I've been thinking about recently.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. And Adriana, anything from you?
Yes, I actually have a sort of a question forming in my mind with respect to what the role is of our institutions in making pressure or incentivizing or encouraging other international students, universities, international institutions that may not be encouraging their minority staff or students or minority sort of population to participate in these types of events, and whether universities like ours have a role in encouraging other institutions to have sort of a code of conduct in this field. I truly think that there's a lot that we can do locally, but there's a lot that needs to be done globally as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So a real appreciation there for the intersection around the international and the national concepts in terms of how we support the increase of representation in the student body and availing ourselves of those environments where we can more easily access those communities. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm just checking. Oh, I'm so sorry, my internet problems have begun. Do we have the second question coming through? I can't currently locate it in the Q&A, but I did see something pop up earlier. Can any of the moderators help out?
Yes, there is another question, kind of, how can places with a longer institutional memory, for example, higher up in university management, tackle these issues of systemic racism, and how do we encourage people to speak out if there is an environment that doesn't necessarily support that?
Okay, so who's going to take that one? Stephen, you look like you're braced to respond.
Well, I think that's a question that's very pertinent to Imperial College, well, and to many other universities in the UK and I guess in the Northern Hemisphere too. I think it's incumbent certainly upon the university leadership to recognise and take very seriously the problem of systemic racism. We know, and because we are currently doing the work to prepare to apply for a race equality charter mark, which has required us to look at our data on who's our staff demographics, and then look at who's in the senior leadership team. And we know that our senior leadership team is predominantly male and predominantly white. And so many of the people who are at the top table, who are making very important decisions about the future of the university and the culture of it and the priorities for the university, will not themselves have direct experience of racism, of sexism, of the experiences of minoritization that primarily and daily affect many of the staff and students that are at the university. So there is a gulf there. Some of it can be bridged through training, and that's something that we've started. And actually, one of the things that came out through the training was the creation of a pilot reverse mentoring scheme, whereby our senior management were mentored by more junior staff from the organisation with a range of protected characteristics, so therefore also including staff from ethnic minorities. And that has been conducted over the past year and has been regarded, I think, by all participants as a great success. There's obviously interesting challenges about configuring it because there's a power dynamic, but obviously that has to be catered for. But I think the senior leadership team has found it extremely valuable, and I think the mentors themselves, I think, have appreciated it. And while they were largely doing the mentoring, they have then themselves got a better understanding, I guess, of the sort of how the organisation works. And often many people at universities don't have a good day-to-day understanding of what happens in the blue box, for example, at Imperial or at the leadership table. And that's so there's a benefit to them, I hope, in terms of future career progression, because they have a better insight, and it's that tacit knowledge of how the system works that's often missing, and often one of the barriers to progression. And so that scheme, the pilot has worked out, and so we're now looking to cascade it down through other tiers of management. And so that's just one avenue that one can, or one solution, or that one can bring to the table. Of course, it's not a magic bullet. It isn't going to solve everything, but it is part of a broader program of work, which I very much hope is actually raising the whole issue of racism and giving our community a much better understanding that there is a problem here to be tackled, and hopefully also then equipping them with the information and the courage, give them the space to discuss these things, because these are difficult conversations, and Melanie, I know you've been involved in work to help promote that, and so we're definitely on a journey. I wouldn't say we're at all in a good place yet, but I think we have taken some steps forward.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So that brings me to the reflection around one of the points that Heather made in your talk, Heather, where you talked about honesty and the reflection for institutions to be honest, to take a look at what can be difficult and uncomfortable. And Stephen, you talked about Imperial's commitment to address these inequalities, and the reverse mentoring scheme just being one example. Adriana, what's your thoughts on this one?
I think that reverse mentoring is still one of those strategies that we have to wait and see how well they will work. I think that in theory, these are all good ideas, and but I think that there's still a component missing on, for example, understanding what the consequences of racism are for the development of our society, and making sure that everybody is conscientious of what the implications of racism are, not only as part of society and institutionally, but also as human beings, essentially. And I think that there's still sort of an angle of mental health as well that we still have to reach. I think that there's a strong correlation between being you know, having witnessed or having been affected by racism and your mental health. I think it affects your mental health on a long term, and I think it's important also to acknowledge this and to understand this. So I think that in a sense, it's important for us to also make sure that we are training our students, and not only our staff, but that we are sort of educating our students to understand what the implications are, so that when they make choices or when they are in the receiving side of this, they understand that they have tools, and on the other hand, that there are consequences as well, that not only will affect them, but that will affect our society as a whole.
Great, thank you so much, Adriana. So that the importance around consciousness building and awareness around impacts and implications of the consequences of racism, and the call for the extension of these ideas in relation to supporting methodologies such as reverse racism. Heather, a word from yourself, followed by Genevieve.
About about the university management being able to think about these sorts of things.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, I'm kind of at a position where I don't have a lot of power in terms of the higher university system in terms of affecting change. But I think one of the things that is that I, highlighted at the end of the talk, part of it in terms of changing institutions is just putting minoritized groups in positions of power and paying them. And I think that that's just a really, an explicit thing that just needs to be done. Reverse mentoring schemes are good, but there's nothing that compares to lived experience either.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Heather. So, power, positions of power, and pay underrepresented staff. There's nothing like the lived experience. Genevieve, from you, and then we'll take one final question.
I'm going to go back to what Adriana said about people being aware of what they say and the impact on society, on the world in general. And, we talk about making society more equal, that sort of thing. I know from an industry perspective, we're looking at, well, how can we make the industries more inclusive? How can we make sure that people in those top positions are female, are from the underrepresented masses? And the only way we can do that is if we have a pool of people that we can recruit. So if you've got an academic system where you haven't got the underrepresented people coming through that the industry can call on, that means the people that end up in those top management positions are your white males. So I think universities and academic institutions do have a challenge on their hand, but they also need to recognize that if they don't get it right, industry can't get it right. We need that pool of people to call upon. So we need the females, the underrepresented people to be coming through, to have those people in the PhD positions, postdoc positions that can then go into industry and become the industry leaders of the future. And without that, we are always going to have that problem of white males in the top positions, females in the, underrepresented.
Great, thank you very much, Genevieve. So the real call here, the challenge around the academic system not being accessible to the pool of people of whom we want to support greater representation institutionally, societally, and in industry. So the challenge for the university sector there, very clear. We have time for one more question. Can the moderators help me? I'm having trouble again seeing any questions come through on my side. One more question.
Yes, I can do that. I mean, the problem of the leaky pipeline, which just came across, it is a real problem. And here is a question kind of considering Heather's talk, saying that we heard that there was even less visibility for early career researchers. How early do we need to intervene to support future researchers, even undergraduates? So I think that kind of closes, or yeah, comes to that leaky pipeline we have.
Absolutely, thank you, Katharina. Any thoughts, final thoughts from panel members on that specific issue? Further elaboration? Stephen, come on through.
Sorry, I hope I'm not being too much of a white man here by jumping in first, but I mean, that's a very big and very important question, and I think the answers will vary across disciplines. And I mean, in the response, some of the responses to the previous question talked about making sure that, you know, the diverse pool that is often seen at lower, more junior levels within a particular research domain is then brought forward, so that, you know, you do get in a senior management team that actually is diverse, has the lived experience of day to day. And but we know that, you know, sometimes it isn't, you know, there isn't a lack of diversity in the pool. We know certainly in many disciplines, and my own is life sciences, and I know that in our, certainly at undergraduate and PhD level, there is actually a good gender balance. It's at least 50-50. It may even be slightly in favor of women at that stage, and you see that persist into first postdoc and even second postdoc, and then it takes a nosedive, okay, from lecturer then through to professor. I'm ashamed to say only 10%, maybe not even 10% of the professors in my department are women, and that's in life sciences, which is a subject that attracts a great many women as students and undergraduates. In other disciplines, I know in physics, then, you know, there's still a problem of you know, the perception is that, you know, men or, you know, prefer physics and whatnot, and it's seen as a more, you know, a less female friendly subject. You know, I don't accept for a moment the notion that women are any less interested in physics or any less capable of doing it, but clearly there are, you know, cultural pressures that are excluding them. The whole pipeline issue, it's about stereotyping and the assumptions that people make in recruitment. It's about the day-to-day experience. Women, of course, face the hugely disproportionate burden of family care, the disproportionate burden of exposure to sexual harassment and harassment of other sorts, which drives them away from a deeply unfriendly academy. And, you know, all of those things then we do need to tackle. And then some of that, of course, then filters into, you know, the work that Heather has talked about. You know, women tend to be underrepresented in publication and in career opportunities because they're less visible, and they're less visible because it is, you know, those with caring responsibilities, they find it harder to get to conferences, and so they do lose out on those opportunities than that, and they suffer a penalty for that. And so it's important to make sure that there are support mechanisms in place, both from their universities but also from conference organisers, about, you know, making sure that there are childcare facilities available, for example. And so there's a whole panoply of measures that one can take to at least try and mitigate some of the effects and the biases that are still very much out there.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So a real recognition there of the broader disproportionate impacts around inequality societally, and how those impact within the variations experienced in science in terms of inequities. Adriana, did you want to come in?
I think that what Stephen has said is spot on. I think that there is a range of additional burdens that unfortunately part of the staff and students have to withstand during their career. Many of those parents are women, and they have to at some point make their decision about what they will focus their life on. And unfortunately for women, it just boils to having to make a decision. Unfortunately, if you're a man, it's not put in the same perspective. There is no decision to be made. And this is definitely something that we all have to work on. But having the personal experience of having just transitioned into the lectureship position, I do think that there is an immense amount of work that has to go in. And I just think that the only way of helping women is incentivizing them and giving them money to pay for childcare. I think that this is the only solution that I see for the leaky pipeline. If you give young parents, some additional money to pay for the time that they would have to spend on childcare, then I think that would level the playing field. I mean, it would have been made a big difference for me, whereas a postdoc, I was not able to pay for childcare on a daily basis so that I could extend my workday by 2 or 3 hours, or whenever I greatly needed it. And I think that really is the only way of changing that, in my humble opinion.
Thank you very much, Adriana. So again, the call around incentivize women, pay for childcare, address the leaky pipeline. Thank you. Genevieve.
I guess I agree with addressing the leaky pipeline, and it comes back down to sort of how do we make sure we keep women in industry and scientific industry and that sort of thing. You know, we're finding at the moment, especially in the nuclear industry, it's very much sort of skewed towards male-dominated industry. So specifically within NNL, it's roughly 30% women, 70% men, and you tend to find a lot of the people in senior positions are male. From a sort of a recruitment perspective, we are actually finding more women are now applying to come through as apprentices, with the idea that they'll do the apprenticeship and then go on to do a degree and a PhD. And that's the career path that they are choosing. And fewer people, you know, we are finding fewer females coming through as people with degrees or PhDs, because it just seems to be they're not applying to the nuclear industry. So that's an interesting thing. So we're trying to sort of find ways of supporting those people that want to choose that pathway and want to come through as apprentices. It obviously for them it's easier for them. They don't end up with that burden of, you know, student loans and that sort of thing, and it gives them that opportunity to have that work experience. And we are quite supportive that when it comes to the degree time, when they actually have to go off and do a couple of days at university, that forms part of their work life and they actually get paid to do that. So it's finding those ways of supporting the women and those people that want to sort of come into industry in a slightly different way, a slightly unconventional way. And that's one of the things we're doing quite a lot of at the moment. Things like, you know, sort of career breaks. In our company, you can take a couple of years off as a career break and come back to your job. So that's quite supported. We quite support people coming in who decide they want to go off and do a PhD. So NNL actually would fund people to actually do PhDs and further their education. So it is quite a supportive industry, but obviously, you know, looking at the figures and looking at the rate at which we're recruiting women, we're still 60 years off getting that parity between men and women in the industry. So we are still quite a way off. But as I said before, you know, it's all about let's attract as many people and as diverse a range of people as possible. But then let's also look at, you know, how do we keep them in the industry, and how do we block that leaky pipeline?
Great, brilliant. Thank you so very much, Genevieve. And again, this real point about creating support and access for those who want to choose our pathway. and the real importance of what that means for creating perhaps unconventional methodologies to support flexibility, to enable that representation to be clear. Heather, a final word from you.
You know, I don't really like the term leaky pipeline. That's sort of why I use it in quotations, because I think it often makes it sound, at least for white women, that these are kind of choices that they're making rather than the choices that they're forced to make. And sort of this idea about, you know, yes, we have a retention issue for white women in sciences, and part of that is for seeing women progress up into the echelons, just an acknowledgement that the barriers are different. You know, women are less likely to get money, they're less likely to be put on grants, they have different publishing strategies when they submit manuscripts, they're more likely to spend more time in review, and this all sort of affects the body of work that women can present, and that affects the ability to promote these people, right? And I think we need to have really honest conversations about those kinds of barriers as well. So aside from the childcare issue, which is very real, there are barriers for us just doing our jobs. And I would say, as I am a white woman, the biggest barriers that I've had has started sort of in the postdoc years in terms of the harassment and those kinds of things that I've experienced. You know, when you're in a situation where you're a postgraduate and the student body is largely 50-50 in terms of men and women, there's kind of this insulation and support group. But as you get further up, I think it becomes harder. And then with respect to underrepresented minorities, there's two separate issues there. You have the retention issue, but then you also have the recruitment issue. You know, at least for the geosciences, we really struggle with recruiting underrepresented minorities. And I think that's in part because the sort of the vision that we see of a geologist or somebody who works in environmental sciences is this white man, you know, on a rock with a hammer in Tibet or something like that. And that's not really how we do geosciences today. And I think that we need to, I don't want to boil it down to a marketing issue, but I think that it is kind of a marketing issue. Do you see yourself as part of the community? And if you don't have people within that community that look like you or that share similar values to you, it's not a community that you're going to want to join. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And again, this real reflection once more that there is also something about an acknowledgement of the choices that women are forced to make and how those barriers impact in relation to just doing our jobs as women. How do we ensure a greater support for marketing? How do we see ourselves? And how can we create this notion of, do I see myself as a geologist for underrepresented groups? I'm conscious of time. I'm aware there may be a few questions we haven't had a chance to cover. I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I'm going to hand back to you, Katharina, just for some final words.
Just you're muted, Katharina.
I think you're muted, Katharina.
I'm very sorry, I should have unmuted myself before. So I would like to thank you, first of all, to the speakers for the very interesting contributions. I also would like to thank the team behind the scenes for running this event so smoothly. I'd like to thank the audience and all the many questions who came into the chat. Unfortunately, due to the time limit, we couldn't answer them, but there are still several very interesting questions in the chat, actually. Yeah, and thanks for coming along. I think it was a very interesting experience and very interesting session. So thank you very much.